Okay, thank you so much, everyone. I'm a newcomer to this conference, so I guess many of you do not know me. I've been involved with animal advocacy only for 2 years now, so I do not have as much experience as the majority of you, I guess. I don't have 10 years plus in the animal rights movement. I just want to share some ideas and observations I've been having in the last 2 years, and especially during the last year when I have been working with an international NGO myself, which is also involved in animal advocacy and animal rights work. So I believe those insights might be valuable to some of you and might actually help to critically reflect on your work or actually on your personal activism when you deal with international NGOs. And I really hope that will be interesting for you. I want to actually highlight that my presentation pretty much continues a line of theory and discourse, which yesterday was presented very nicely in the presentation of Gertie. I'm not really sure how to pronounce her name. She did such an outstanding presentation about animal resistance and animal agency. So actually what I want to pick up on is the idea of white saviorism, which he explained quite nicely, and I think that applies not only for our relationship with animals, but also for the work and cooperations which are taking place on global level. So yeah, I'm going to speak about that. I hope it's not going to be too confusing. On the end, I'm going to put like a lot of effort and care to like try to connect all of those concepts which come from completely different field of study and to apply them to animal rights work. And I'm already wasting way too much time from this presentation, just like doing housekeeping. So I'm going to dive right into it. Yeah, what was actually the reason why I wanted to do that? I recently attended a panel discussion in another animal rights event. Actually, it was animal welfare event, but doesn't matter. So there I just noticed that the speakers kept speaking about developing and developed countries. And that left like a very strong, in a way, like saddening impression on me. And I just wanted to address why nowadays we cannot speak about developing countries like in any way, and how we should like bear in mind the power relations which are inherently present whenever big NGOs or like other organizations which are in a position of power, which are based in the global north, are running any kind of campaign or project with organization, activist or grassroots group based in the global south. Yeah, a little bit about etymology. So actually I just want to say that from my point of view, nowadays we cannot really use those terms anymore. They are not developing and developed countries. I'm going to work in my presentation with the terms global south and global north. That does not apply to geographical locations of any of those like countries, which I mean by that. It is more a term by global north. We basically, or like people who work in development studies, mean industrialized and wealthy nations and former colonial powers, which nowadays in a position of power, and by global south we basically mean the rest of the world. And for example, global south can be Southeast Asia, can be Eastern Europe, could be also Africa or like parts of Latin South America and so on. So they are not really necessarily geographically overlapping, but I think they represent and actually in a way like uncover those power relations way better and like in a much more accurate way than speaking about developing and developed countries. And I think that's something we need to reflect also into the movement and like try to incorporate in our work. Okay, that was way too long again as an intro, so I'm just going to yeah, start with an overview of my presentation, how it is built. So yeah, basically I already mentioned that I'm going to speak that the discourse of development itself is Eurocentric, paternalist, and imbued with relations of power. I highlighted those three terms because they're going to be present throughout my presentation, and I'm going to like elaborate on each of them later on. First of all, I'm going to like do a little bit of dry theory. I hope I do not bore you too much, but after that I'm going to like try to connect it to actual developments and to animal rights. So yeah, I want to like give a short overview of paradigms in development studies which are not valid nowadays or like are not spoken or like by any way have any validity today because they have been criticized over periods of time, and I think we have to be aware of those critics and why that's not the case anymore, how we don't speak about like other countries and like other social movements which are based there. And then I'm going to speak about post-development, which from my point of view is a really good concept, like coming as close as it could be to like really address the things I want to speak about. And finally, I'm going to, depending on the time, I'm going to speak about notions of power and discourse. Yesterday we had a presentation about Habermas and discourse ethics, and this time I'm going to look at it from post-structuralist point of view. I'm going to try to speak a little bit slower so you can keep up with that. And on the end, I'm going to, as promised, relate all of this to the animal rights movement. I'm going to consult my notes more in the first time of the presentations. In the second part, it's going to be a little bit more open, and I'll be happy for your input. Okay, so basically, as I mentioned, development from my point of view constructs and it ultimately results from colonialism, and I think it is historically produced discourse which serves to establish, stabilize, and reproduce hegemony and control. I had a big part of my presentation which was dealing with Gramsci and neo-Gramscian theory. I had to take it out because otherwise it was too much, but hegemony is, I think, a concept which we need to be aware when we speak about development and about international relations. What were the dominating theories in development studies and how did they change over time? Basically, also the whole idea of development aid was pretty much a tool of the Cold War confrontation, and it started by the end of the Second World War when there was global struggle for power over big parts of the world by back then big colonial powers which wanted to establish their spheres of influence. So development aid in its very origin was actually meant to solidify this, to be to build satellite states and to actually help each of the blocks win this ideological war. So that's also is a really important thing which I want to throw in there. So the first year which development studies tried to outline, to explain how the international cooperation between states should look like was the modernization theory. It's quite old one and has been criticized really widely over time, so I'm not going to really waste too much time on this. There is the so-called development ladder, and the modernization theory was drafted by Walt Whitman Rostow, who was an US-American historian. So basically, Rostow suggested that following initial investment, countries would set off on a way of evolutionary process in which they progress up the 5 stages of development ladder. So the idea is that with help from the West, like the rest of the countries which were not industrialized or not developed from that perspective back then, would reach similar level of development. I would not read the individual steps. I personally find the fourth one pretty much symbolic for this theory, the drive to maturity. I mean that there was a lot of discourse setting and a lot of Western-centric perception in this, but it was an early stage of development theory, and that pretty much reflects it. So one of the most prominent critics of the conventional development economics of this time, also I want to say at this point that a big part of this theory was around economics, so that was the major criteria in which the whole development discourse was organized around. So one of the most prominent critics of the conventional development economics of the time, and the modernization theory in particular, was the German-American sociologist and historian Andre Gunde Frank. Underdevelopment, as Frank writes, is not due to the survival of archaic institutions and the existence of capital shortage in regions that have remained isolated from the stream of world history. On the contrary, underdevelopment is generated by the very same historical process which also generates economic development, in other words, the development of the capitalism itself. World capitalism destroyed or transformed earlier social systems even as it came into existence, converting them into sources of its own further development. So the dependency theory was the first theory which came out of this criticism and aimed to overcome this tendency towards equal level of economic development, which was predominant before that. So basically the dependency and the world system theory, which was outlined a couple of years later, took upon this criticism, and there were 2 theories which attempted to deliver a more holistic approach, relevant for the time when they were outlined. The basic message of dependency school draws on the conclusion that European and US-American development was predicated on the active underdevelopment of the non-European world. Here there's still the vocabulary is still quite colonial, as I must say, but for the time it was an attempt to really critically reflect on this. For dependency theorists, Europe's development was based on external destruction rather than internal innovation. Brutal conquest, colonial control, stripping non-Western societies of their people, resources, and surpluses, rather than single-mindedly undertaking the rational modernization of Europe. At the core of this theory lies the separation between so-called first world, center, and non-European third world, periphery. The relationship took a form of dependence in which some countries, the dominant, achieved self-sustaining economic growth, while others, the dominated, grew as a reflection of changes in the dominant countries. Center and periphery became increasingly polarized as capitalism developed the one and underdeveloped the other in a single historical process. Dependency reshaped the social structures in the periphery towards a small, enormously rich elite and a mass of poor people. Emphasis was placed on economic rather than social or cultural interactions. Yeah, with this, I'm going to make a jump into the theories and come to the post-development, which I think is the one theory which actually summarized that criticism, which was very much in the developing stage back then, and it was like mostly directed towards economic aspects. And post-development aimed to bring a whole new development paradigm. And actually the idea is that post-development's project has been to slay the development monster. In other words, to break the consensus about development being necessary, self-evident, positive, and unquestionable, which was quite radical this time. It was about like 20, 25 years ago when that became like, a new line of paradigm. What distinguished post-development from previous critiques in development studies was that it did not intend to improve the attempts to bring about development, but rather questioned the very objective, advocated the rejection of the entire paradigm, and instead called for alternatives to development. So I have here some quotes also from Toro Escobar, who was one of the scholars who was really active in the post-development discourse. So basically he says we're interested not in development alternatives, but in alternatives to development. That is the rejection of the entire paradigm. By acknowledging the colonial legacy of development as a project, as a discourse, as a concept, the global north needs to confront itself. A practical post-development, first of all, must mean to undevelop the north. Post-development starts at home. I know here the vocabulary is a bit polarizing, maybe in a way, on developing the north, but I think that the main message here is that there is a need for critical reflection first, like on our side of the power, and then getting that out further. So development is criticized as a failed project of universalizing the way of life of the developed countries on a global scale. Furthermore, it helped establishing a Eurocentric and hierarchic construct defining non-Western, non-modern, non-industrialized ways of life as inferior and in need of development. Finally, it represents economic rationality centered around accumulation and, what is even worse from my point of view, a capitalist logic of privileging monetary values. It legitimizes a concept advocating interventions into the lives of people defined as less developed and branding those as justified in the name of a higher evolutionary goal. Particularly problematic is the idea that societies can be compared according to their level of development, that they are developed and less developed countries, that the latter can be found in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and are in need of development projects, experts or aid, provided by the former, are assumptions that are by no means self-evident. They constitute a historically specific way of looking at different societies in global inequality, naturalizing the norms and historical processes of the European South. This reveals the process of othering and the problematization of deviance. The naturalization of the self enables us to define the other as deviant. The universal scheme allows one to measure and compare according to a Eurocentric norm and to thus define the majority of humanity as underdeveloped. Among the other alternative worldviews differing from the anthropocenic and logic of capitalism, I want to mention two others. The one is Swaraj, which is a radical ecological democracy, and degrowth. Degrowth is actually quite prominent idea in many countries nowadays, until nowadays. So ecological Swaraj, emerging from the Indian civil society, entails communal self-rule and self-reliance, but also a holistic vision of human well-being, respecting the limits of Earth and the rights of other species. Degrowth, as an approach, on the other hand, devised in the North, is linked to the idea of sufficiency and is seen as an attempt to repoliticize environmentalism and is calling for downscaling of production, consumption in industrialized countries as a means to achieve environmental sustainability, social justice, and well-being. So yeah, and here is one final slide about what post-development is basically proposing. I think I mentioned many of those fundamental questioning of core features of the development discourse, which countries to be focused on economic growth, productivism connected with rhetoric of progress, capitalism, and so on. Alternative to Western homogenizing model and the dominance of a framing of development as progress. Yeah, sorry for everybody who is a native speaker here. When I'm not that nervous, I usually don't make so many mistakes when reading. I hope it's still understandable. So it's also a counter term that involves multiplicity of systemic critiques and suggests different ways of living. Yeah, and I also have two more quotes, and then we are done with this post-development agenda. The political activist Gustavo Esteva referred to development's unburied corpse and the writer Eduardo Gudina's co-development as zombie category, not really alive anymore, but not quite dead either. So yeah, into the next part of my presentation, I would like to actually bridge all of those ideas which I outlined so far about development and power, which is inherent in the relations between Global North and Global South, and actually break it down to the individual actors which are involved into that. And from my point of view, one of the most important actors, international NGOs. The international NGOs are based in the Global North, and they are mostly non-profit organizations who actually distribute funds or fund projects or like help the implementation of projects in the Global South. And I think for them as an actors, there is like, there is a lot of expectation and also a lot of responsibility in the way they perform. I have another slide where I just want to recommend you this talk by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. I don't know if maybe some of you have heard it already. I think it reflects very well on the whole problematic of power relations, which I tried to describe in the first part of the presentation. She speaks about stereotypes and like creating stereotypes in former colonies, and I think that's a really, really good entry to this topic. So yeah. Yeah, I also have one more quote, which I want to read out. Is from development worker Uma Kotari from 2005. Knowledge of development professionals and the Western notions of progress embodied within them continue to be reinforced through the power embedded in the relationship between donor and beneficiary. This process is enabled by the continuous reinvention and articulation of distinct forms of professionalism, changing fads and fashions of development, that require the acquisition of new forms of expertise, skills, techniques, knowledge. In this way, the separation between expert and local knowledge and intellectual distance between donor and recipient is maintained. And I think this is pretty much true until nowadays, and I think there is always this power between, like, in the relationship between donor and beneficiary, regardless of which type of, like, project or which type of cooperation we are looking at. So, yeah, I think that's quite an important thing. So, yeah, I'm going to move now to a very brief look at the post-structuralism and why I think that power, knowledge, and discourse are three relevant terms from that. I'm actually basing this part of the presentation on the work of Michel Foucault. As I mentioned yesterday, we had like another insight on that from the discourse ethics. So this is like another type of discourse. I mean, not another type, but like another look at that. So yeah, regarding power, Foucault examines how power is exercised in everyday relationships rather than power as a direct physical oppression of the powerless by the powerful. He argues that knowledge and power are intimately interconnected. Every exercise of power depends on a scaffold of knowledge that supports it. Claims to knowledge advance the interests of certain groups while marginalizing others. In practice, this often legitimizes the mistreatment of these others in the name of correcting and helping them. Foucault challenges the idea that power is wielded by the people or groups by way of episodic or sovereign acts of domination or coercion, seeing it instead as dispersed and pervasive. Power is everywhere and comes from everywhere. So in its sense, it's neither an agency nor a structure. Instead, it's a kind of a meta-power or regime of truth that pervades society and which is in constant flux and negotiations among the actors. And about discourse, so discourse basically describes the institutionalized way of speaking and writing about reality that defines what can be intelligibly taught and said about the world and what cannot. Foucault was interested in ways in which some statements are allowed to carry meaning and others not. It was not simply that some statements were more coherent or packed a better argument than others, but that there were filters on discourse practices which allowed some statements through and excluded others. This position extends to academic knowledge, and also Foucault sees such knowledge as governed by discourse rules. Finally, there is also like a power of resistance in discourse. So Foucault believed that there are possibilities, believed in possibilities for action and resistance. He was an active social and political commentator who saw a role for the organic intellectual. To challenge power is not a matter of seeking some absolute truth, but of detaching the power of truth from the forms of hegemony, social, economic, and cultural, within which it operates at the present time. Discourse can be a site of both power and resistance, with scope to evade, subvert, or contest strategies of power. Okay, so yeah, in the next slide. So yeah, right. So in the next slide, I'm going to share a personal experience. So I'm gonna take out a little bit of that like very, very dry reading of like theory. Of my background before I joined the animal rights movement, I was involved myself in like development organizations, volunteered and worked for some. And actually when I started like getting involved during my study times in activism, I pretty much participated in what yesterday was so nicely explained as white saviorism. So I used to like join projects which were completely, how should I say, there was no need for like people to be flown all over the world to do a project where instead the community can be empowered to just like tackle the issue themselves. So I got a lot of insight from both sides. Like I was there and I participated in such projects because I didn't reflect on them. And then I actually started working for a development cooperation NGO which pursued self-empowerment approach, which I found like very, very interesting. So how we're working there is that all the projects and all the funding, we're working with communities in Nepal. So all the project and all the funding was done via baseline studies, which means that we first asked the communities to identify problems and issues which they are struggling with right now before we actually actively engaged into like any kind of like grant or like monetary funding for that. So that allowed for the participants and like the regions with which we're working to actually redefine the agenda which they wanted to have addressed. And I find that as an approach like the way that cooperation should take place nowadays. And that should be in a non-discriminatory and inclusive way. And towards the individuals and the communities which are participating in that. So that was for me a really, really nice experience back then. Right, so now I'm actually coming to the second part of the presentation. This would be, okay, this I'm a little bit over the time. So this one is like about the how I think from my perspective and from my observations, this whole thing relates to animal rights advocacy. I've been working during the last year with like some grassroots groups, activists from Eastern Europe, and I also met many of them like during travels and during like my during other conference and networking sessions, and I got some insight about like how the work there takes place. So I pretty much would place some like statements and observations, and then we can discuss that to see if you agree with those or not. So my personal observations are following. There are power relations between donors and beneficiaries inside of the animal rights movement, which are no different than examples from so-called development cooperation. International NGOs who are financially funding a number of projects and campaigns are based in the global north and need to be aware of their position of power. They also have a direct impact on the grassroots animal rights movement, which means that my example with Eastern Europe, where I have the most insight, which belongs to the so-called Global South, organizations in Eastern Europe are still depending mostly on grants and the implementation for the implementation of campaigns. There is also a rise in the number of local offices of international NGOs in Eastern Europe, which is actually quite interesting development because they're like, especially in countries where the animal rights advocacy is more or less established or quite advanced. I'm always surprised to see that an international NGO opened a local office which runs a campaign which has already been addressed by 3 local organizations. Finally, there is a tendency of claiming victories of the grassroots movement, which is a clear demonstration of power for international NGOs. I have 2 more slides and then we can go into the Q&A. Right, furthermore, I think there is a clear tendency towards welfare campaigns, many of which are not only funded by international NGOs, which I abbreviate as INGOs, but this process also accompanied by knowledge transfer. Finally, there are projects or campaigns based on helping or saving, and is clearly communicated in the way the campaigns are organized, which applies to country, region, community, but also the actual campaigning of saving animals. Often those projects are based in the countries of the Global South, in the case of Eastern Europe. Right, so finally, final slide, personal recommendations. I think the priority should be always on the grassroots animal rights work. I think that carrying out baseline studies to determine where the needs and challenges lie locally, instead of defining the direction of development of an organization or group through grants, is necessary. I think that financial support outside of project or campaign binding grants should be also given, because there is a huge lack of paid working hours, which is a problem for many organizations in the area which struggle with that. And finally, cooperation should be based on clearing expectations and outcomes from both sides. Okay, so actually I left this last part of the presentation rather open, because I don't know if you agree with those observations and if you follow the logic why I think the whole power exchange actually applies to the animal rights movement, but you can definitely ask me. And with that, I'm going to finally conclude this presentation. Thank you very much for paying attention.